evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you for coming out. I know you were contemplating staying out in the warm sunshine or the cold sunshine. Thank you for coming inside. My name is Liz Schultz, and I'm the Executive Director of the Oberlin Heritage Center. If this is your first program with us, or maybe it's been a while, the Oberlin Heritage Center is a local historical society. We're located just across the street, either behind the post office or behind Lorenzo's, whichever of those resonates with you. Our mission is to preserve and share Oberlin's unique heritage and to make our community a better place to live, learn, work, and visit. If you're not already a member of the organization, please consider becoming one. We are not part of the college or the city, so in order to do programs like this, it's really made possible through member support. And we have some information about the Heritage Center over there. Thank you to the Oberlin Public Library for allowing us to use this space for free and also for providing refreshments here tonight. We would appreciate your feedback about this program and others, so everyone got an evaluation form on your chair. If you don't have a pen or pencil with you, you can use one from our sign-up sheets after the program. Just a few announcements about two upcoming programs. One, on April 1st at Kendall at Oberlin in their auditorium, there is a free public program, All Are Welcome, about Larry Doby, who integrated the American League of Baseball in 1947. So, we tried to time it right around opening day, but not on opening day. So come out if you're interested. Also, on this blue flyer over on the table, it's also our annual meeting and sign up if you're interested. So we have community awards and a program about shipwrecks of Lake Erie. So hope you can join us for that. But it is my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker. Amanda Manahan is the Museum Education and Tour Manager of the Oberlin Heritage Center. She's worked in this capacity from 2015 to 2022, and then rejoined the organization again in 2023. Amanda earned a bachelor's degree in anthropology with minors in history and music from Heidelberg University, and then a master's in history museum studies from the Cooperstown graduate program. Perhaps some of you were able to attend the Black Businesses program in February, just a month ago here, that was also coordinated by Amanda. Now, for tonight's program, I have already found the information that she has gathered very interesting, and I'm sure you will as well. And it has been a pleasure working with so many other organizations offering programs to collaboratively celebrate the Big Read. With that, please join me in welcoming Amanda Manahan to the podium.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and thank you everyone for coming out again on a beautiful day. This is one of several programs that's being offered over the next few months related to the National Endowment for the Arts Big Read of Toni Morrison's beloved. Partners in this year's Big Read are the Lorain Public Library, the Lorain Historical Society, the Community Foundation of Lorain County, the Oberlin Public Library, and us, the Oberlin Heritage Center. So some of these numerous free programs coming up, you can see up here, a lot of them are for youth and adults. Check out the Big Read schedule. I think a lot of you grabbed the pamphlet that we have over here near the books. Also, if you have a smartphone, you can scan the QR code here and see the programs as they get updated on the website. And then also, you might have noticed we have a stack of books, beloved. So these are complimentary copies here at the library. So if you'd like to grab a copy tonight, please do so. Or if you know somebody who might want to, they're going to have them behind the information desk that anybody can grab from them. But before we get started with this program, I want to give a couple of disclaimers. First, I will be referencing the novel Beloved, so I hope most of you have read the book, or at least you're familiar enough with the plot that I'm not giving away too many spoilers. However, for those of you who have read it, please note that the details, the names, the events in the novel, they are not a true representation of the history of the Garner family that inspired Toni Morrison. In fact, so much of the story is muddled and fragmentary due to its emotionally charged nature, as well as the sensationalized news with contradictory reports and the racialized narrative surrounding the events. And also due to the fact that few words from the family themselves were actually recorded, so we never really get the true story from their perspective. Second disclaimer, tonight's program will mention content that includes mature and disturbing themes, which may be unsuitable for younger audiences or people who may have experienced their own trauma. And some of the primary sources included in this program perpetuates racist stereotypes and language. That all being said, Margaret Garner's story is one of love. It's love for her family and sacrifice for her family. It's of resistance to the institution of slavery. So I hope that you do stick around, but I also understand if you need to step out for any reason. Toni Morrison, as many of you may know, grew up in Lorain, Ohio. She was born with the name Chloe Walker. After graduating from Lorain High School in 1949, she worked for the Lorain Public Library system for a time before moving east and then publishing her first novel, The Bluest Eye, in 1970. Another local connection is that the Toni Morrison Society's headquarters moved to the Mary Church Terrell Library on the Oberlin College campus in 2012. So Beloved, our main focus for this evening, was Morrison's fifth novel published in 1987. Morrison was inspired to write Beloved by a newspaper clipping that was included in a 1974 book that she was involved with called The Black Book, which was a compilation of written and visual sources that explored the history and experiences of African Americans throughout time. The clipping she read was originally published in the American Baptist on February 12, 1856, and it was written by P.S. Bassett. And in this article, he chronicles meeting both Margaret Garner and her mother-in-law, who strongly resembles the characters that we see in the novel. We will come back to this article later on in the program, and I will also mention that for Morrison, it was more the feeling that was important to her. She did not do much additional reading or research beyond this article before she started creating her novel. So just to try to make things a little more clear, especially for those of you who have read Beloved, here are some connections to make. So Margaret Garner, our main character, is Setha in the book Beloved. Mary Garner, the older Mary Garner, who was the mother-in-law of Margaret, she is the equivalent of Baby Sus. Priscilla, or Scylla, as she was often referred to, was the infant daughter of Margaret, and she is the character of Denver is based around her. And then Mary, the 2-year-old daughter, she is Beloved. And then finally, Robert, Margaret's husband, is kind of in relation to Hallie. So from here on out, though, I will mostly be referencing the real historical figures and events, which, again, greatly differ from the novel. Both stories, however, they center around Kentucky and the greater Cincinnati area. Here are some figures, some stats that give us some insight into what was happening in Kentucky in regards to slavery. So the state was founded in 1792, but slavery had already been well established. The plantations here were mainly dedicated to the production of hemp and tobacco. By 1850, 28% of the state's white families had enslaved people. By 1860, 20% of the state's population were enslaved. That was over 225,000 people. And only around 5% of the state's black population were free people. By the 1830s and on, cotton production in the Deep South required significant labor, and Kentucky enslavers determined that selling enslaved people to the South was a more lucrative financial venture for them. So Kentucky was vital to the internal slave trade. Around 16%, or 71,000 people, were sold south from Kentucky, hence the phrase, being sold down the river. In support of the slave trade, there were slave brokers in Kentucky who would acquire lots, human beings, and they would have established pens that acted like small warehouses that would confine these individuals until transportation was secured. John Anderson's slave pen from Mason County, Kentucky, is one of, if not the only extant slave pen in the country, and it was reconstructed in the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati in 2004. Margaret Garner, the central figure of our story, was born June 4th, 1834. She was born in Boone County, Kentucky, the northernmost county in the state, and it lies just west of Cincinnati along the Ohio River. The 1850s slave schedule showed that the county, Boone County, had 194 enslavers and 792 enslaved people. Specifically, Margaret lived in Ridgewood, Kentucky, which is about 15 to 20 miles away from Cincinnati. Ridgewood in the mid-19th century, like most in the area, was comprised of several farms. It was very rural. The Ridgewood Presbyterian Church was established the same year that Margaret Garner was born, 1834. And it allowed enslaved people to be part of the congregation as early as 1843. This is likely the church that, if not the exact building because that one burned down, but the church that Margaret Garner attended at least for a time. In 1849, at the age of 15, she married Robert Garner, and also an enslaved man who lived on a neighboring farm owned by a man named James Marshall. My research did not indicate whether or not this was an arranged marriage, but it was likely a welcome one by the enslavers given the nature of the Kentucky slave trade. A year after the two wed, they welcomed their first child, a son named Tom. The plantation that Margaret was born on and where her mother was enslaved was called Maplewood Farm, and this is where she would live most of her life. Described as, quote, mulatto, it was likely that Margaret's mother was raped by one of her white enslavers. When she was old enough to work as a domestic, Margaret was brought to the house, and she primarily worked inside. This subjected her to having to work very closely with her enslaver, a man named Archibald Gaines. Eventually, Gaines, a married man, forced himself upon Margaret. It is likely that at least one of, if not more, of her subsequent 4 children were born as a result of being raped by him. 3 of her children were described as either light-skinned or light-eyed, and they were all born within 5 to 7 months following the birth of one of the white Gaines children. This indicates that Gaines likely raped Margaret during the times that his wife was pregnant. The years of this abuse would also have been known to Margaret's husband, Robert, who was often sent off, perhaps even hired out, for long periods of time, and then he would come home to a pregnant Margaret. Robert knew that his mother was also subjected to a similar abuse from her own enslaver over the 25 years that his father had been separated from her. It was said that she bore 8 children during this time, and all of them were sold away from her. This sexual violence against these 2 women was just one of the many considerations the family contended with when making the choice to seek freedom on the Underground Railroad. And to Robert, this was the way to fulfill his duties as a father and a husband and protect his family. Robert was about as well informed and prepared as any person could be who planned to free his family, because Robert was entrusted by James Marshall to travel long distances for work. Robert knew the lay of the land, he had frequently traveled to Cincinnati, and he was familiar with the city. And he knew which routes were more likely to be patrolled. Robert prepared the family, and they waited for their time to flee. By the 1850s, the Underground Railroad was in full swing. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Law was a constant threat to the system, and the main battleground was along the river between Kentucky and Ohio. The town of Ripley, Ohio, for example, was crucial to this network, with some of the most active Underground Railroad agents at its time, such as the families of the free African American John P. Parker and the Presbyterian minister John Rankin. In December of 1856, the Ohio River froze. And this was not a common event back then, but much less rare than today. And this prompted freedom seekers from northern Kentucky to seriously consider making the journey north. One such person was John Price. Might be a familiar name to those of you in the audience. He was the man who was at the center of the famous Oberlin Wellington rescue. Price and his small group crossed about 50 miles to the east of Cincinnati near Ripley, Ohio. Although Price would find himself in peril at many times on his journey, including with his near capture and return to slavery that was intercepted by the people of Oberlin Wellington, his journey likely ended happily, with him ending up in Canada as a free man. The Garner family, unsurprisingly, they were also eyeing this opportunity. On January 27, 1856, a pregnant 22-year-old Margaret, with her husband Robert, his parents Simon and Mary, and their 4 children, Tom, Sam, Mary, and Priscilla, they embarked on their journey to Ohio. Robert had secured or stolen one of the enslavers' horses and a sleigh to help transport the family the 15 or 20 miles it would take to reach the Ohio River. Again, this was a rare opportunity, and that same evening, nine other freedom seekers also crossed the river at the same location, but likely separately from the Garners. The large group crossed the river at Covington, Kentucky into Cincinnati. Cincinnati was a bustling, rapidly growing city of commerce and transportation. By the 1850s, it was the 6th largest city in the United States, with around 115,000 people. Part of this growth was due to the new immigrants finding viable work opportunities in the city. The pork packing industry, for example, was especially booming, which earned the name of Porkopolis for Cincinnati. That was its nickname. Cincinnati also had a significant African-American presence, with neighborhoods along the river such as Bucktown, and Little Africa. Immigrant populations often collided with African-Americans who were also trying to find the same work opportunities, the same resources. There had been several violent race riots in Cincinnati where immigrant mobs, namely Irish and German, attacked and brutalized Black neighborhoods and residents. Some of these riots were additionally fueled by the racist Ohio Black Codes, which greatly restricted the rights of Black people. Even though many fled from this violence, by 1850, Cincinnati still had one of the largest Black populations in the country, about 3,200 people. The Garners were traveling just west of these communities to locate the home of Elijah Kite, a relation of Margaret's. The group did not know exactly where he lived, so they made numerous inquiries of the local people. This, unfortunately, was likely their downfall, because they were gaining more attention as they were approaching people. The family arrived at Kite's residence near Mill Creek, which is highlighted in red here. It's around 6th Street and Mill Creek, seen on the map. And the intention was not to be there for very long. In fact, Kite had approached the famed Quaker abolitionist and Underground Railroad agent Levi Coffin for his aid. Levi Coffin, his wife Catherine, and their family moved to Cincinnati from Newport, Indiana, about 9 years prior. He wanted to manage a wholesale business in Cincinnati that only sold products that were produced by free labor. While living in Indiana, though, the Coffin's home, which still exists today as a museum, served as an important Underground Railroad station, and with hundreds of people seeking shelter there over the years. This activity would earn Coffin the nickname the President of the Underground Railroad. Coffin maintained his activities as an agent on this network to freedom, and his new location along the Ohio River set his operation up perfectly. One such rescue was known as the Escape of the 28 in 1853, which is depicted here, in which abolitionist and rescuer for hire John Fairchild, no relation that I could find so far to the Fairchilds of Oberlin, brought 28 enslaved individuals from Boone County into Cincinnati, where he was aided by Levi Coffin and others, and they were able to successfully navigate the route all the way to Canada. So Kite knew Coffin would be able to help them. He was key to ensuring that the Garners' safe journey would be acquired, and that once Coffin was found, a plan was devised to secret the family north, using some of Coffin's connections in the area. However, before they could begin enacting their plan, A mob of men, including the enslavers, some of their friends, and a force of U.S. Marshals had arrived to the Kite home. Only mere hours after the Garners escaped from Richwood, their absences had been noticed and they were quickly being tracked. Kite's residence was already looking like a viable option for the freedom seekers to seek shelter, and this was confirmed by those who witnessed the family trying to find the home. The family was now trapped, but they resisted. Robert, his father Simon, and Elijah Kite took up arms at the entrance and barricaded it as well as they could, with the windows too. In the rear of the home, in another room, Margaret and her mother-in-law Mary secured the 4 children. Robert was said to have taken the revolver that he had stolen from James Marshall and fired multiple rounds in an attempt to scare off their aggressors. When one U.S. Marshal broke through a window, a shot hit him in the arm or the hand, scaring him off. Then the group of white men grabbed a log or a large piece of timber and they used it as a battering ram to knock down the front door. Robert fired off another shot, striking a marshal and injuring him, but it was to no avail. The men were overpowered and they were being seized. Margaret, well aware of the danger the family was in, looked at her children. As a mother, her priority was to protect her children from harm. And as an enslaved woman, that harm was the threat of a lifetime of forced servitude and abuse. This was particularly true for her 2 daughters, who would likely grow up and suffer the same treatment that she and her mother and her mother-in-law had all endured at the hands of their enslavers. Within a moment, she made her choice and sought to protect her children at any cost, even if it meant their deaths. The details of the escape and the capture of the Garners is, again, fragmentary and muddled, but nothing compared to the events that transpired after the slave catchers broke through the home. One report incorrectly identified who was killed, others were incorrect in their account of how Margaret attempted to end her children's lives, but the fact was, Margaret attempted to kill all of her children out of love and mercy, and then with a plan to take her own life as well. She was successful in ending the life of her 2-year-old daughter, Mary, a child who was said to be quite beautiful and beloved by her mother. Mary was one of the children also described as light-skinned, so she was likely the daughter of Archibald Gaines. When the enslavers and slave catchers reached the back room, they discovered the scene before them. The 2 sons were injured but alive, and so was the infant daughter. Margaret was overpowered and removed from the home. This painting that you see was done over 10 years later after these events by a man named Thomas Satterwhite Noble, and he did this in 1867. Noble was born in Kentucky to a slave-owning family, but reportedly rejected slavery as an institution. However, when the Civil War broke out, he served with the Confederate Army. Following the war, he began his art career and focused mainly on African-American subject matter. And he would move to Cincinnati in 1869 to oversee the McMicken School of Design, now known as the Art Academy of Cincinnati. The portrayal of Margaret Garner, this one, is probably the most commonly used. There is no known photograph of her or even drawings from her trials. Looking at the 2 centermost standing figures, the white man on the left seems appalled, while Margaret's face shows anger and her hands are accusatory. She is looking directly at the man who sports red like she does, and this likely symbolizes that this is Archibald Gaines. While we can see both the tragedy of the child's death and the indictment of slavery here, there are several details that are inaccurately portrayed, including the genders of her children and which of them succumbed to death. Perhaps Noble read an inaccurate report, as there were many. Perhaps it was artistic license. In either case, the painting itself is problematic, in that by changing the sex of the child, it takes away some of the context of why Mary sought so hard to end the life of her daughter first. The children also have darker complexions than what was described in reality, and this change neglects to show the layers of abuse endured by Margaret. The title of the painting is also problematic, The Modern Medea. This title compares Margaret's actions to those of the Greek mythology character Medea, who is often portrayed as a villain. While the Greek mythology, Medea kills her children out of spite and revenge for being left by her husband Jason, Margaret's actions were an attempt to protect her children. So it is unfair to compare the two narratives, and the painting neglects to convey the personal experiences of Margaret, or really any enslaved Black women of the time. Upon arrest, the Garners were brought to the federal courthouse in Cincinnati, and Archibald Gaines laid claim, and he demanded a certificate of ownership to bring Margaret and her children back to Kentucky. Claim to Robert and his parents was more unclear. However, because James Marshall's son neglected to bring proper documentation and power of attorney to act on his father's behalf, they decided that they were going to take the Garners to jail overnight. It was reported in the January 29th edition of the Cincinnati Daily Gazette that Archibald Gaines returned to Kentucky with the body of 2-year-old Mary. End quote. He was taking it to Covington for interment that it might rest in the ground consecrated by slavery. The Garners received visitors to their cell as they awaited their trials, and one of those was Levi Coffin. He was devastated at the results of his failure to secret the family out of the city. He wrote specifically of what it was like to see Margaret in the aftermath. He said, quote, "Those who came to speak words of comfort and cheer felt them die upon their lips when they looked into Margaret's face and marked its expression of settled despair. Her sorrow was beyond reach of any words of encouragement and consolation, and can be realized in all its fullness by those who have tasted a cup equally bitter." Another one of Margaret's visitors is someone, again, maybe more familiar to Oberlin, Lucy Stone. Stone graduated from Oberlin College in 1847. She then returned to her home state of Massachusetts, and she began a career as a paid lecturer for the New England Anti-Slavery Society. She was both a popular and controversial speaker, given that public speaking was not deemed an appropriate activity for women of the time. But Stone also used this platform to address women's rights. In 1855, Stone married Cincinnati businessman Henry Blackwell, and famously kept her last name rather than taking her husband's. Just 9 months later was when the Garners found themselves in great peril. Lucy went to visit Margaret on several occasions in jail and served as counsel for her. However, rumors spread that Stone was trying to sneak a knife in so that Margaret could finish off what she had started if the trial went against her. Colonel Francis T. Chambers, who acted as the lawyer for Archibald Gaines, went as far as to publicly accuse Stone of this in court, although not when she was in the room. So when Lucy Stone found out, she requested a moment to speak to the court after adjournment one day. And she stated, "I am only sorry that I was not in when Colonel Chambers said what he did about me. Am I giving a knife to Margaret? The faded faces of the children tell too plainly to what degradation female slaves submit. Rather than give her little daughter to that life, she killed it. If in her deep maternal love she felt the impulse to send her child back to God, to save it from coming woe, who shall say she had no right to do so? With my own teeth would I tear open my veins and let the earth drink my blood, rather than wear the chains of slavery. How then could I blame her for wishing her child to find freedom with God and the angels where no chains are?" Little was reported, again, in the words of the family themselves and directly, but there were some detailed recollections by their visitors. Many said that Margaret was quiet while jailed and that she would only respond very succinctly. For example, when she was asked about a scar on her face, Margaret replied, "White man struck me." This abuse would be referenced later in Stone's address that I just mentioned to the court, and was used as evidence of the treatment Margaret endured at the hands of enslavers. To Reverend Henry Bushnell, another visitor, in response to the question of her actions, she stated, "It was my own. I knew it was better for them to go home to God than back to slavery." One of the few records of Margaret's words were taken by P.S. Bassett of the Fairmont Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. Bassett preached at the Cincinnati prison, and he was able to meet with and interview Margaret and her mother-in-law Mary just about 2 weeks after the event. The article was published of this exchange the article that was published of this exchange was the newspaper clipping that Toni Morrison read, which again served as her inspiration. Lucy Stone and Levi Coffin reflected the fact that Cincinnati had a very strong abolitionist community, and that the community stepped up for the Garners to the best of their ability. John Jolliffe, one of the most respected abolitionist lawyers alive at the time, volunteered to represent them, and the sensational case came before the U.S. Commissioner John Pendery in Ohio. Jolliffe argued that because Margaret and Robert had made several trips to Cincinnati with the Gaines family and they were within Ohio's borders, a state which slavery was illegal, then they themselves were free. This was a year before the infamous Dred Scott decision, which began when Scott sued for his freedom due to a similar circumstance of his enslaver taking him into free states. Once the case eventually made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court voted 7-2 against Scott, and this decision set the precedent that people of African descent were not citizens of the United States, and therefore they could not enjoy the rights and freedoms associated with that citizenship. Jolliffe was essentially trying to ensure that the Garners would be kept in Ohio for the duration of their trials through this argument. However, the opposing side made the case that because the Garners had willingly returned to Kentucky each time, that they had surrendered that free status. The big power at play here was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law required the return of freedom seekers and empowered enslavers and bounty hunters with the right to go into free states to retrieve individuals, contributing to even greater tensions between the slave and the free states. Every state and locale in the country had to abide by this law. Authorities were expected to enforce it, and it deputized the public so that they could aid in these captures. The law reinforced the fact that enslaved people were viewed as property by this country, and that anyone who broke the law faced steep fines and jail time. The trial of Margaret and her family would be watched closely, and the stakes were twofold. One, Jolliffe could not convince the court that the Garners were free, and the opposing argument won out. But he had another approach. Could he successfully argue that Margaret Garner should be tried in Ohio rather than Kentucky, meaning that she would be tried under the state laws rather than the federal laws, namely the Fugitive Slave Act? Both Jolliffe and the Garners wished for Margaret to be tried for murder and Robert for accessory to murder, thus delaying their return to slavery. Not only this, but a murder trial gave them a better chance at long-term freedom, and it would set a precedent for the nation, being tried as people rather than property. Jolliffe summarized what was riding on this case in a plea to the commissioner. He said, "Sir, your decision in this case is of the utmost importance. On it rests the peace of this nation. I hear the groans of the dying and the clash of steel against steel. If you decide against these defendants, this union cannot stand. The people would rise en masse and rend the union asunder." Combing through the microfilm at the college archives and of the Oberlin evangelists did not yield much regarding the reports and local reactions to the Garner trial, save for this article, which the editor summarized the significance of the Garner trial as well, and what this decision could mean for personhood, humanity, and justice. Said, quote, "The case is agitating Cincinnati to its very center. If there are human hearts there, those hearts must feel. It seems they do. Indignation against the horrid system was never before so deep, so earnest. That blood has a voice to witness against the unutterable wrongs of American bondage, and it will be heard." The Garner trial lasted longer than most fugitive slave trials, which were typically resolved in a matter of minutes, hours. The trial for Margaret and her children was separate from the trial of Robert and his parents, given that they were claimed as property of different men. Their trial lasted weeks. This is in part thanks to the fact that the Garners had top-notch legal representation in Jolliffe and the support of outspoken abolitionists and political leaders such as Stone and the newly elected Governor of Ohio, Salmon P. Chase. However, despite these emotional pleas and sound legal advice and arguments made by those supporting the Garners, Commissioner Pendery gave Gaines and Marshall a certificate of ownership and remanded the 7 remaining family members to slavery on February 26, 1856. Pendery stated in previous fugitive slave trials that he was personally against the institution, but in regard to his decision, he stated that, quote, "The question is not one of humanity that I am called upon to decide. The laws of Kentucky and the United States make it a question of property. It is not a question of feeling, to be decided by the chance current of my sympathies." Pendery further about that, quote, "Our highest moral obligation in this case is to administer impartially the plain provisions of the law." Another person who was watching the trial closely was Frederick Douglass. Although he was not able to visit Margaret or be in Cincinnati at the time due to his busy lecture schedule. However, the Margaret Garner story was picked up by newspapers across the country, and her case was quickly becoming one of the most covered fugitive slave trials in history. This included Frederick Douglass's paper, in which one of the men on his editorial team hailed from Cincinnati and had the ability and connections to keep a close eye on the case. This continuous coverage allowed for the paper to lay out the legal, moral, and political implications of the case and what its results would mean for the nation. Douglass, continuing on his busy lecture circuit, would end up giving a talk in Cincinnati on March 3rd, mere days after the conclusion of the Garner trials, and he would have been informed of the tragic decision to return them. The conditions of remanding the Garners back to their enslavers included an agreement on the part of Archibald Gaines to make Margaret available for trial in Ohio if murder charges were successfully brought about. Jolliffe was successful in his efforts, and a warrant for Margaret's extradition from Kentucky was issued by Governor Chase. However, going back on his word, Gaines sold the family down the river, and he sent them to his brother in Arkansas. They were then sent to the slave auctions of New Orleans via steamboat on the Mississippi River. Governor Chase was enraged. On the way, the steamboat was involved in a collision, and in the confusion and in the chaos, Margaret either fell or jumped into the water with her infant daughter, Celia. The cook aboard, a black man, dove into the water, and he was able to bring Margaret back to the safety of the boat, but Scylla was lost. Some of the witnesses claimed that Margaret, quote, displayed frantic joy upon learning the fate of her child. To Margaret, another daughter was saved from what Jolliffe called the seething hell of American slavery. The rest of the Garners made it to New Orleans, and then they were sold to an enslaver in Mississippi. 2 years later, Margaret died of typhoid fever at the age of 24. Robert was found in 1870 near Cincinnati when he was injured by working on a riverboat, and his attorney was working on a lawsuit against the boat owners. Here he was approached by a reporter for the Cincinnati Chronicle, and he agreed to give an interview. Robert relayed the story of his family and what happened after Margaret's death. According to Robert, before she died, Margaret made him promise to never marry in slavery, but to live in hope of freedom. Somehow, in 1862, he was able to free himself, and then he fought with the Union during the Civil War. He ended up, after the war, moving to Cincinnati. About a year late after this interview, in 1871, Robert passed away and was likely buried in a potter's field in the city. So, how was Margaret and the Garner family kept in American memory? In addition to the modern mural that you see here on the flood wall in Covington, Kentucky, that was painted by Robert Dafford, in the modern Medea painting that you also see here, Margaret and her story has resonated with others who have interpreted her story through art and literature, such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was a prominent African-American female abolitionist lecturer, poet, and co-founder of the National Colored Women's Association. In her poem entitled "The Slave Mother, A Tale of the Ohio," she pays tribute to Margaret and her tragic situation. The 16-stanza poem relates the story opening with the line, "I have but four, the treasures of my soul," demonstrating Margaret's status as a mother and her love for her children. The poem continues the tale, detailing the escape, brief glimpse of freedom, the slave catchers on their trail, and the issue of the free state of Ohio not being able to save them. Harper calls Margaret a heroic mother, and she tries to persuade her audience to grant sympathy for her actions. As the poem ends, Harper cries out for justice against treacherous slavery and for men and Christians to stand on the side of freedom. There's no indication that Harper ever met Margaret, like some of the earlier abolitionists mentioned, but she, like the other writers of the time period, she used this tragic situation to speak out against the injustices of slavery. John Jolliffe also carried the story of the Garner family with him, including in his writings, such as this one, Belle Scott. It was an anti-slavery novel that he wrote in 1856, the same year as the Garner family escaped in trials. And it features narratives that parallel the experiences of freedom seekers like the Garners who escaped but were captured and returned back into slavery. And then, of course, we have Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. Following the success of her novel, the story was visualized into a movie in 1998 starring Oprah Winfrey as Setha and Danny Glover as Paul D. And side note, again, this film is being shown as part of the Big Read event, so again, check out the schedule. Toni Morrison also partnered with Richard Danielpour to create a 2-act opera called Margaret Garner. And they chose to use the historical figure's name rather than the fictional one. Danielpour composed the music and Morrison wrote the English libretto. The opera was a co-commission by the Michigan Opera Theater, the Cincinnati Opera, and Opera Philadelphia, and it premiered on May 7, 2005 at the Detroit Opera House. And here are some photos from that. The Detroit premiere featured American mezzo-soprano Denise Graves as Margaret. While the opera was not historically accurate either, Morrison brought Garner's story to life in a whole new way to a whole new audience. As Morrison told NPR in 2010 while talking about the opera, she said, quote, "The interest is not in the fact of slavery. The interest is what happens internally, emotionally, psychologically, when you are in fact enslaved, and what you do in order to transcend that circumstance. That is really what Margaret Garner reveals." And then besides the flood wall, the only publicly visible physical representation of Margaret and her family's story is a dual-sided historical marker, which was commemorated in Covington, Kentucky in 1990. Her story and life, however, are also featured by the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. Margaret Garner's story, albeit again fragmented and even distorted at times, shows us that despite her status as an enslaved Black woman and the tragedy she faced, she still enacted her own agency. Her agency as a woman, as a mother, and as a wife. Margaret endured years of abuse and forced servitude, but she survived her family. She resisted the institution of slavery by making the choice to free her family on the Underground Railroad, aware of the dangers. She planned and prepared and navigated all of this while pregnant and 22 years old. And then she faced the unimaginable, being caught and returned into slavery. She enacted agency and responsibility over the fate of her children. The responsibility and love of a parent is complicated and powerful. Throughout this program, you may have found yourself asking, what would I have done? Or even questioning the morality of her actions. Toni Morrison had been struggling with the same questions when writing Beloved. In the book, the choice is summed up by the character of Baby Suggs, the mother-in-law of Setha, that she, quote, could not approve or condemn Setha's rough choice. Morrison came to this conclusion through a conversation with a friend in which she asked him whether or not Margaret had the right to kill her child. Her friend responded, it was the right thing to do to keep her child from slavery, but she had no right to do it. Toni Morrison wrote Beloved to give a voice to the voiceless and to explore Black women's experiences during slavery. The novel challenges us to confront these narratives and to think critically and stretch our emotional muscles. Stories like these teach empathy, perhaps in forms that are unrecognizable to us through our own modern day and lived experiences. According to Morrison, quote, delving into literature is neither an escape nor a surefire route to comfort. It has been a constant, sometimes violent, always provocative engagement with the contemporary world, the issues of the society we live in. And so over the years, I have tried several times to read Beloved, but I always hit a wall. Once I understood the story of Margaret Garner, the pieces fell into place for me, and I was able to navigate the rest of the book. If you have also struggled with this book, I hope that this history guides and inspires you to reach the end. Thank you. If there are any questions, we do have a microphone that we pass around so that everybody can hear.
I think your presentation was amazing. The work that you've done is excellent. My question to you is, did you find any leads to time and sand?
I tried looking that up, and there's a lot of mythology also about the story. In one report, I saw that Robert, in that interview, say that he was living with his two boys, Tom and Sam. They were adults at that point in Cincinnati. Another report said that he stated that they were still in the South. So there's, again, a lot of contradictory reports. So I always try to find, sources, and I couldn't find the actual interview of Robert. So I always try to look at multiple sources and see which way it seemed to be heading more. Thank you for that question, Phyllis. Well, thank you again, everyone. Please, again, feel free to pick up a copy of Beloved, check out the other schedule of events, and we still have plenty of refreshments, I think? Maybe? Okay. All right, thank you, everyone.